On Thanksgiving morning, when the whole world was getting ready to gather around tables filled with laughter, Helen Carter was in her small kitchen, peeling carrots with hands that had worked harder than anyone would ever remember. She believed this day, this family, and this soup would prove that all her sacrifices meant something. But little did she know, the same soup she poured her soul into would soon be poured onto her, and it would become the beginning of a story no mother ever dreams of living. Helen Carter had spent 67 years of her life building a world for everyone but herself. She was the kind of woman who gave without asking, who worked without resting, who loved without keeping score. From the outside, you might have seen just another older woman with gray hair tied neatly in a bun, moving slowly with a limp from years of standing in front of stoves and sinks. But to her son, Mark, and to everyone who ever ate at Carter's table, she was the hidden foundation, the reason it even existed. Back when Mark was young, it was Helen who held the diner dream together. She had scraped coins out of old coffee tins, saved tips from sewing work, even sold her wedding ring after her husband passed, all to give her son a chance. "If you believe in food, son, then I believe in you," she told him. And with that, Carter's table was born. Customers came, not just for the plates of eggs and bacon, but for the soup Helen made every morning. It was thick, warm, and somehow tasted like comfort itself. People said her soup could chase away a bad day, but Helen never took credit. She let Mark stand in the spotlight, let him shake hands with customers and smile for the newspaper photo when the diner was voted best in town. She was proud, too proud to care that her name never showed up on the award. She thought, that's how it should be. A mother doesn't need recognition. A mother only needs her children to succeed. Her life had been a series of small sacrifices stacked like bricks. She remembered the nights she stayed awake to mend Mark's uniforms, the mornings she skipped breakfast so he could have an extra egg on his plate, the winters she wore the same old coat so he could have new shoes for school. And when Mark wanted to buy that old building on Main Street to turn into a diner, she worked double shifts just to help him pay the first month's rent. Every brick, every table, every booth in Carter's table was marked with her quiet labor. Now, as Thanksgiving came around, Helen felt both tired and hopeful. Her hands trembled slightly as she chopped sweet potatoes. Her back ached as she leaned over the stove, but her heart was steady. This was the holiday that meant family, and though things had felt colder recently, she believed food could heal that. She was making her famous pumpkin soup, the one customers always asked for during the fall, the one Mark had grown up eating. In her heart, she thought, maybe if I bring this to the table, maybe he'll remember everything we've shared. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon, nutmeg, and roasted squash. The steam fogged her glasses, and she smiled, wiping them with her apron. She pictured her son as a little boy again, sitting at the counter, swinging his legs while she placed a steaming bowl in front of him. "Best soup in the world, Mom," he used to say. That memory alone gave her strength to ignore the stiffness in her knees. But there was something different in the air this year. Mark had grown distant, distracted. He was busier, colder, running the diner more like a business than a family place. His wife, Linda, often whispered that the menu needed modernizing, that Helen's soup was too old-fashioned. Helen heard the words, but she tried to believe they didn't mean much. After all, how could something made with love ever be old-fashioned? As she ladled the soup into a container to take to the diner, Helen whispered to herself, "This is for family. This will remind them." She wrapped the container in a towel, careful not to spill. Her small house was quiet as she put on her worn coat and slipped into the chilly November air. The sky was pale gray, the kind that promised snow soon, and the sidewalks were lined with brown leaves crunching underfoot. Walking toward the diner, she carried more than soup. She carried decades of unspoken devotion, years of invisible sacrifice. She carried hope that today would be different, that Thanksgiving would not just be about the turkey or the business or the customers, but about remembering who had been there all along. Helen didn't see her story as a revenge story, not yet. To her, it was still just life, just love, just what mothers do. She believed sacrifices didn't need to be tallied, that her reward was simply watching her son succeed. What she didn't realize was that the very thing she cherished most, the role of being the silent backbone, was about to be the very thing that shattered her heart. At the door of Carter's table, she paused, looking through the window. The diner was packed, laughter bouncing off the walls, waitresses darting between booths. Mark was at the counter, smiling for a group of customers, looking confident, successful, untouchable. Helen's heart swelled with pride and she thought, yes, this is worth it. Every ache, every sacrifice. Today we'll sit together. Today we'll be family. She pushed the door open, the bell jingling softly as she stepped inside, carrying the soup like it was treasure. She had no idea that in just a few hours, the same treasure would become the weapon of her humiliation, and that this Thanksgiving would mark the end of everything she thought she knew about family, sacrifice, and love. Thanksgiving had passed, but the memory of that day still clung to Helen like the smell of smoke on an old coat. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that families always have moments of tension, that maybe Mark was just stressed from running the diner. But deep down, she could feel something heavier settling in. A distance that wasn't just about a bad mood. It was a wall being built, brick by brick, right in front of her. At first, it was in the little things. The way Mark answered her calls with one-word replies. Yeah, fine, busy. Gone were the days when he'd ask about her health or laugh at one of her small jokes. When she offered to bring over some of her homemade soup for the staff, Linda was the one who answered instead. We're trying new menu items now, Helen. Maybe it's best if you don't bring the old recipes. Customers are changing. The words were polite, but the tone was sharp, as if Helen's efforts were an inconvenience. Helen would sit at her kitchen table in the mornings, staring at the phone, wondering if maybe she'd said something wrong. She would replay conversations in her head, searching for mistakes that weren't there. A mother's heart always blames itself first. The coldness showed itself in the diner, too. When Helen came in to wipe down tables or check on the soup, Linda would quickly step in, steering her toward the back. Why don't you rest, Helen? We've got it covered. Covered. That word stung. It sounded like they were putting a blanket over her, tucking her away, hiding her out of sight. One evening, Helen stood near the counter, watching Mark talk with a group of new customers. They were young, college kids passing through town. He smiled in a way she hadn't seen in years, full of energy and charm. Helen felt proud, but also invisible. He didn't introduce her, didn't even glance her way. She was just another old woman in the corner, a shadow in her own son's success story. She carried these moments home with her, piling them up quietly. In her little living room, she'd look at the photos on the wall. Mark in his high school baseball uniform, Mark with his first car, Mark holding the best diner plaque. Every one of those milestones had been built on her sacrifices, and yet now, when she spoke, her words seemed to fall into an empty room. Maybe you felt that before. The sting of being present but unseen, of giving everything yet receiving only silence. It's a pain that cuts deeper than words, isn't it? If you know what I mean, tell me in the comments. I want to hear if you've ever lived through that same quiet heartbreak. The coldness grew bolder as weeks went on. At family dinner one Sunday, Helen brought her famous cornbread. She set it gently on the table, waiting for someone to notice. But Linda slid it aside, replacing it with a store-bought loaf she said was more modern. No one touched Helen's dish. No one even said thank you. She smiled politely, but inside she was crumbling. Later that night, as she washed the untouched cornbread pan, her hands trembled. She remembered the nights she had stayed up late baking for Mark's school bake sales. How proud he'd been when his tray sold out first. When did pride turn into embarrassment? She wondered. The worst moments weren't the sharp words. They were the absences. not being called when decisions were made about the diner, not being invited when staff took photos for social media, not hearing, "I love you, Mom," for months. It wasn't cruelty in the open, it was cruelty in the shadows, a slow erasure of her place in her own family's story. Helen tried to hold on. She kept bringing soup, kept offering her help, kept smiling even when she was dismissed. She told herself, "This is just a phase, he'll come around." But each attempt at warmth was met with colder and colder air. It was like standing in a room where the heater had broken, shivering while everyone else acted like they couldn't feel it. What Helen didn't realize was that this coldness wasn't an accident. Linda wanted a new image for the diner, one that didn't include the old-fashioned touch of a mother's recipes. And Mark, well, he was too busy chasing success to notice the cost of losing the very person who built his foundation. For Helen, every dismissal, every ignored word, every polite but pointed push aside was like a small crack in her heart. She had believed love would always be enough, that sacrifice would be remembered. But as the days passed, she began to see the truth. In their eyes, she wasn't the backbone anymore. She was just baggage. And that realization, as gentle and devastating as it was, would be the seed of the storm to come. The coldness wasn't just distance, it was a warning, a foreshadowing. Because when love turns to ice, it doesn't just freeze, it shatters. The Saturday after Thanksgiving should have been a chance for healing. Helen believed that maybe, after the chaos of the holiday rush, her son would soften. She thought maybe he'd call her into the kitchen, smile the way he used to, and say, "Mom, thank you. I couldn't do this without you." She clung to that hope like it was oxygen. Instead, what she got was the moment that broke something inside her. The diner was crowded, every booth filled, the air buzzing with laughter and clinking silverware. Helen walked in quietly, carrying a fresh pot of her pumpkin soup. She had made it that morning, rising before the sun, telling herself that no matter what had happened, family traditions mattered. Maybe this simple act would remind her son of everything she had given, everything she had stood for. Mark stood behind the counter, looking sharp in his pressed shirt and new apron. Customers leaned in, hanging on his every word. He was the proud owner, the face of Carter's table. Helen felt her chest swell for just a moment, until she stepped closer. "Mark," she said softly, setting the pot on the counter, "I thought the customers might enjoy the soup today. It's cold outside." Mark didn't look at her the way a son should look at his mother. He didn't smile. He didn't even lower his voice. Instead, he frowned and said, "Mom, we talked about this. We don't need that anymore." The word stung, but she tried to laugh it off. "Oh, come on, people love it. It's the soup they grew up with. Remember when—" Before she could finish, Mark cut her off, sharp and final. "I built this diner myself. I made it what it is. Stop acting like you had anything to do with it." The room fell silent for Helen. It didn't matter if anyone else heard him. The words were enough. In that one moment, decades of sacrifice were erased as if they'd never existed. Her hands trembled on the counter. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he didn't mean it, that maybe stress had twisted his tone. But his eyes were cold, his jaw set. He meant every word. Helen felt her knees weaken. She thought of the nights she had gone hungry so he could eat, the coins she had dropped into jars to help him pay rent, the recipes written in her own hand that had once filled this diner with warmth. And now he was telling her none of it mattered, that she hadn't done anything. She forced herself to nod, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Of course, Mark," she whispered, "if that's what you want." But inside, something cracked. That night, Helen sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at the faded linoleum as if it held answers. The house was quiet, too quiet. She thought about all the times she'd believed love was enough, that giving and giving would be repaid with gratitude. Instead, she realized she had been invisible all along. Her sacrifices weren't treasures. They were taken for granted. She replayed his words in her head, each one cutting deeper. I built this diner myself. It was more than denial. It was betrayal. The next morning, she didn't go to the diner. For the first time in years, she stayed home, staring at her empty hands. She wondered who she was if she wasn't the mother behind the counter, the quiet force in the kitchen. She wondered if she had wasted her life building something for someone who would never acknowledge it. Helen wasn't angry yet. Not the kind of anger that flares hot and wild. No, this was the cold kind. The kind that settles in your chest like ice and makes you realize you've been living in someone else's story, not your own. She tried to remind herself of Mark as a boy, the son who once clung to her hand, who cried when she dropped him off for his first day of school, who used to say, "Mom, you make the best soup in the world." Where had that boy gone? When had he turned into a man who could erase his mother with a single sentence? The days that followed were heavier than any she had known. At the grocery store, she overheard people talking about how Mark was a self-made man. She clenched her jaw, knowing the truth, but too weary to speak it. When she passed by the diner window, she saw customers smiling at her son, never knowing that every smile was built on her quiet labor. She had always believed recognition didn't matter, but now she saw it clearly. Being denied, being erased, being told you never mattered. Those wounds went deeper than hunger, deeper than exhaustion. They went straight to the soul. And for the first time, Helen began to wonder if her life's work had been for nothing. She didn't know it yet, but this cruel denial was the turning point. This was the moment that would transform her story, not because she planned to fight back, not because she wanted revenge, but because once you've been told you don't matter, you have only two choices: disappear quietly or rise and reclaim yourself. Helen didn't know which path she would take yet. All she knew was that the silence of her kitchen, the absence of gratitude, and the memory of her son's words would haunt her until something inside her finally broke free. If words can cut, actions can destroy. For Helen, the denial she had heard from her son was already heavy, but the humiliation that followed was something far worse. It wasn't just about being told she didn't matter. It was about being shown in front of others that she was nothing at all. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, just a few days after Mark's cruel words. Helen still came to the diner, holding on to hope, telling herself maybe she had misunderstood. A mother's heart always looks for excuses, always wants to believe her child didn't mean to hurt her. She wore her best blouse, pressed her skirt carefully, and walked in with a smile that was too fragile to last. The place was busy, as it often was on weekends. Families filled the booths, children swung their legs, and the smell of fried chicken mixed with coffee in the air. Helen stood near the counter, waiting for her son to notice her. Mark glanced over but didn't smile. He barely nodded, then turned back to his conversation with Linda. When a table opened up, Linda motioned Helen over. "Here, sit here, Helen." But the chair she pointed to was wobbly, one leg uneven, a chair that staff usually kept in the back. Helen tried to adjust it, her hands shaking as she sat down. The chair creaked loudly under her, and she flushed with embarrassment. She saw the quick glance from the waitress, the way a young couple nearby smirked before looking away. It was small, maybe meaningless to others, but to Helen, it felt like being pushed into the corner, like a burden. She told herself to stay calm, to breathe. She looked at the menu, though she knew it by heart, and decided to order a simple bowl of soup. When the waitress brought it out, Helen barely had a chance to lift her spoon before Linda leaned over, smiling too brightly, and slid the bowl away. "Oh, let's give this to Mr. Thompson instead. He's a loyal customer." Helen's soup was replaced with a sandwich she hadn't ordered. It was subtle, maybe even polite in appearance. But the message was clear. Helen's needs came second, even in the diner she had built with her own hands. She sat quietly, forcing herself to chew, each bite turning to ash in her mouth. She thought of the nights she had stayed awake making soup for the morning rush, how Mark once told her it was the heart of the diner. Now, even a single bowl wasn't hers to keep. The worst came later that evening. Helen had brought a small wrapped gift for her grandson, a little toy truck she had found at a thrift shop. She had polished it, wrapped it in blue paper, tied it with a thin ribbon. She placed it on the counter gently, imagining the boy's smile. But when Linda noticed, she picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were something fragile and unwanted. "Oh, thanks," she said quickly, tucking it onto a shelf behind her. Hours passed, and the gift stayed there, forgotten, gathering dust next to unused menus. The child never saw it. Helen's chest ached as she left that night. The cold air hit her face, but it was nothing compared to the chill inside. She walked home slowly, her steps heavy, carrying the image of that little blue-wrapped gift sitting untouched in the shadows. Humiliation doesn't always come with loud insults or raised voices. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in chairs that wobble, in bowls taken away, in gifts left unopened. It's the kind of pain that looks invisible to outsiders but feels unbearable to the one living it. At home, Helen sat in her dimly lit kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from her. She thought of all the meals she had cooked at this table, all the birthdays she had celebrated, all the nights she had stayed up worrying about bills and homework and broken hearts. This kitchen had been her kingdom once, her place of pride. Now, even here, she felt small. She touched her hands, wrinkled, worn, scarred, from years of knives and hot pans. Once these hands had built everything. Now they trembled as if they had lost their purpose. She whispered to herself, "When did I stop being part of the family? When did I become invisible?" Her words faded into the silence of the house. She closed her eyes, and in the stillness she remembered being younger, when Mark was just a boy sitting at the counter, swinging his legs, grinning at her cooking. He had once loved her food, her presence, her every small gesture. That boy seemed gone now, replaced by a man who no longer saw her at all. The humiliation wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about being erased, replaced, discarded. She had been the foundation, but now she was treated like an afterthought, a ghost haunting the diner instead of its heart. That night, Helen cried for the first time in years. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that soaked into her pillow. She cried for the soup taken away, for the chair that nearly collapsed, for the little blue gift left unopened. But more than anything, she cried for the truth she could no longer ignore. Her sacrifices had become invisible, her presence unwanted, her love unreturned. And in that grief, something inside her began to shift. Not anger yet, not fire, but a deep, aching realization that humiliation, once endured too long, can become the soil where a new kind of strength begins to grow. Sometimes the cruelest wound isn't open rejection. It's the illusion of acceptance, the flicker of hope right before the flame is snuffed out. For Helen, that moment came on a chilly Friday evening, just when she thought maybe, just maybe, her place in the family hadn't vanished entirely. The diner was preparing for a special event. A local food blogger had promised to stop by, and Mark was in rare spirits. He moved around the room with energy, checking the tables, straightening menus, rehearsing lines in his head about family, tradition, and local roots. When Helen walked in quietly, carrying her scarf wrapped tight around her neck, she expected the usual cold glance. But instead, Mark said, "Mom, glad you're here. Stay for the pictures later." The word startled her. She froze, the sound of "Mom" ringing in her ears. It had been weeks since he had called her anything with warmth. Her lips trembled into a smile. "Of course," she said softly. For the first time in a long time, she felt a spark. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe the cruel words and humiliations were behind them. She spent the next hour bustling quietly, wiping tables, helping a waitress fold napkins. Linda didn't stop her this time, and that too felt like a small victory. Helen's chest swelled with cautious pride. She thought, Maybe they've realized how much I mean to this place. Maybe I still matter. As the blogger arrived, cameras in hand, staff hurried to pose behind the counter. Mark motioned toward his mother. "Come on, Mom, stand here with us," he said, his voice unusually light. Helen's heart leapt. She adjusted her blouse, smoothed her skirt, and hurried to his side. For the first time in years, she felt seen. The staff shuffled around, making space, and Helen stood tall despite her aching knees. She thought, "Finally, they want me here. They're recognizing me." The photographer raised the camera, preparing to snap the shot. And then, just as the shutter was about to click, Linda's hand touched Mark's arm. She leaned in and whispered something. Mark hesitated, glanced at his mother, then cleared his throat. "Actually, Mom, why don't you step to the side, just for this one? We'll get another later." The staff shifted awkwardly. Helen froze. Her son's hand gestured gently but firmly, guiding her out of the frame. The camera clicked. The moment was gone. She stepped aside, her cheeks burning, blinking rapidly to keep tears from spilling. "Of course," she murmured, but there was no later. No one called her back in. The pictures went on without her. Mark shaking hands, Linda smiling, the staff laughing. Helen stood at the edge of the room, her figure reflected in the diner's window, like a ghost no one saw. When the photos were posted online that night, the caption read, "Carter's Table, family owned and proud." The image showed Mark, Linda, the staff, and even the blogger grinning wide. Helen wasn't in a single frame. Not one. She scrolled through the photos slowly on her old phone, each swipe cutting deeper. She had stood there, ready to be part of something she built, only to be erased at the last second. It wasn't just absence, it was deliberate exclusion. Helen sat at her kitchen table long into the night, the glow of the screen reflecting in her glasses. She thought of the decades she had spent giving everything to her son. The sacrifices, the soup, the sleepless nights, all of it led here, to a family photo where she didn't exist. She whispered to herself, "How can you erase someone who gave you everything?" Her voice cracked. The empty house gave no answer. The pain wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, suffocating. False recognition had cut deeper than outright denial. Being invited only to be pushed away, it was a cruelty sharper than any insult. It was the confirmation that in her son's eyes, she was not part of the story anymore. Helen didn't know what would come next. She didn't know that this night, staring at photos she wasn't in, would be the last time she held on to the hope of being recognized. From here on, the hope itself would begin to die, leaving room for something else, something stronger, something that no denial or humiliation could take away. But for now, in that quiet kitchen, with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ache in her chest, she sat alone. The glow of the screen faded as her phone slipped from her hand, and with it, the last fragile piece of her old faith that love and sacrifice would one day be seen, slipped away too. There are many kinds of silence. There's the kind that comforts you at night when you're finally resting, and then there's the kind that crushes you, that makes you feel like you no longer exist. For Helen, the silence that followed the family photo incident wasn't peace. It was erasure. It began with the phone. She used to get calls every morning, even if just quick updates from the diner. "Mom, we're out of potatoes," or "Can you bring more soup?" But days went by, then weeks, and her phone stayed quiet. She checked it constantly, convinced she must have missed a ring. But there were no messages, no missed calls, no one needing her anymore. Then came the group texts. The family chat used to buzz with chatter about specials at the diner, new menu ideas, or even simple things like Mark sending photos of his son's baseball game. Helen scrolled one evening to see if there was any update, only to realize she wasn't even in the chat anymore. At some point, without notice, she had been removed. Her name, her number, gone. She sat there staring at the empty screen, her thumb trembling as she tried to open the thread that no longer existed. It felt like someone had locked a door and thrown away the key, leaving her outside in the cold. The final blow came on her late husband's Memorial Day. Every year since his passing, the family gathered at the cemetery, laying flowers, sharing stories. Helen woke that morning, dressed in her dark coat, clutching the bouquet of white lilies she always brought. She arrived at the cemetery, heart heavy but steady, only to find the place empty. No son, no daughter-in-law, no grandchild. Confused, she called Mark. The phone rang once, then went to voicemail. Hours later, she saw photos on social media. Mark, Linda, and their child standing at the grave, smiling with flowers. The caption read, "Family is everything. Family is everything, but not her." Helen stood there in the cold, the lilies shaking in her hands, realizing she had been deliberately left out, not forgotten, chosen to be excluded. That's what hurt most. She placed her bouquet down gently, whispered a prayer, and walked away. Each step felt heavier than the last, like her very existence was being erased, not just from their lives, but from history itself. At home that night, the silence roared. She cooked herself a small meal but barely touched it. The chair across from her sat empty, the one where Mark used to eat as a child, the one she had polished for years. Now it mocked her, a reminder of everything that had slipped away. Isolation isn't just being alone. It's being invisible to the people you love most. And sometimes, that's the kind of pain you can't explain to anyone else. Have you ever felt that? Like you were standing in the middle of a room full of people, but somehow you were the only one unseen? If you know that feeling, share your story in the comments, because no one should carry that weight alone. Helen tried to hold on. She told herself maybe this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe they had forgotten to call. But the evidence piled up. No invitations to family dinners, no mention of her at church events, no one stopping by her house anymore. The world she had built with her sacrifices was moving on without her, and she was left standing still. She found herself wandering the streets of town just to feel human again, greeting neighbors, exchanging small talk at the grocery store. But even there, whispers reached her ears. Mark's doing so well, running that place all by himself. Each word was another dagger, another reminder that in the story everyone believed, she had no part at all. One evening, she walked past Carter's table. Through the window, she saw her son laughing with customers, Linda bustling around proudly, the staff moving with energy. The diner was alive, full of light and warmth. And there she was, outside, staring in like a stranger. The place she had built was no longer hers. Tears blurred her vision as she turned away. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, watching others live in the space she had carved out with her own hands. The loneliness wasn't just in her house now. It followed her everywhere, clinging to her like a second skin. Back home, Helen sat in the dark, no lights on, no TV humming. She whispered into the emptiness. Am I really gone to them? Am I really nothing now? The silence answered with nothing but its crushing weight. Isolation had swallowed her whole. She was no longer a mother, no longer part of a family, no longer part of the diner. She was just Helen, alone in her house, holding memories no one else cared to remember. And in that silence, something deep inside her began to stir. It wasn't anger yet, not even strength, just a faint realization. If they had erased her, maybe it was time she stopped waiting for them to write her back in. Maybe it was time to write her own story. Loss doesn't always come with funerals or goodbyes. Sometimes it comes quietly, so quietly that you almost question if you imagined it. For Helen, this kind of loss crept in one piece at a time, until the life she had built felt like it had been scrubbed clean of her presence. It started the afternoon she stopped by the diner to pick up a few of her belongings. She still had a locker in the back, tucked away with her apron, some old recipes scribbled on stained note cards, and a framed photo of her and Mark standing outside the diner on opening day. That photo meant everything to her. It was proof that she had been there at the very beginning, shoulder to shoulder with her son. When she opened the locker, the apron was gone. The note cards were missing. And the photo? replaced with a glossy flyer advertising Carter's Table. New vision, new flavor. Helen froze, her breath catching in her throat. She rifled through the locker, the shelves, even the trash bin nearby. Nothing. Her things had simply disappeared. She asked a young waitress about it, her voice shaky. "Do you know where my photo went, or the recipes?" The girl shifted awkwardly. "Oh, Linda said we were cleaning up the old stuff, making space for the new menu." Old stuff. That's what her life, her memories, her recipes had been reduced to. Old stuff to be tossed out like clutter. Helen forced a smile, nodding as though it didn't matter, but inside she felt the floor tilt beneath her. Later, she walked into the dining area, her eyes scanning the walls. For years, a small frame with her pumpkin soup recipe had hung by the counter. It had been a customer favorite, a tradition. But now, in its place, was a chalkboard that read, "Try our new autumn bisque." No mention of her, no trace of the soup she had poured her soul into. She sat down at a booth, her hands trembling. Customers passed by, chatting happily about the new flavors, completely unaware that the old flavors had belonged to her. To them, it was just progress, just business. But to Helen, it felt like watching her life's work vanish in real time. When she got home that night, she opened her family album for comfort. Page after page of photos told her story. Birthdays, Christmas dinners, the first day the diner opened. But when she flipped to the most recent pages, something felt wrong. The last few photos she had received from Mark's family were missing. She checked the envelopes, the drawers, everywhere. Gone. Had she misplaced them? Or had they never been given to her at all? She realized with a hollow ache that her house hadn't seen new family photos in years. It was as if time had moved on without her, as if the record of her place in the family had been cut off. She thought of the little toy truck she had wrapped for her grandson, the one left on a shelf at the diner. She wondered what had happened to it. One afternoon when she went back, she looked for it, hoping maybe the boy had played with it after all, but it wasn't there. A busboy told her quietly, "I think it got tossed when we cleaned up." That was the moment it hit her. It wasn't just her recipes, her photo, or her gifts. It was her. She was being erased piece by piece until no trace remained. Helen sat alone that night in her quiet kitchen, holding an empty frame. The photo that once filled it was gone, but she couldn't bring herself to throw the frame away. It was proof that something had once existed, even if the world pretended it never had. She whispered to herself, "Am I disappearing? Or have they already forgotten I was ever here?" The question lingered in the air like smoke, suffocating and impossible to clear. The next morning, she walked past the diner again. From the sidewalk, she could see the new posters plastered on the windows, shiny, modern images of food that wasn't hers, smiles that didn't include her. Customers inside laughed and clinked glasses, oblivious. To them, nothing had changed. To her, everything had. She pressed her hand against the cold glass just for a second and pulled it back quickly before anyone could see. In that reflection, she didn't see Helen, the mother, the cook, the builder of dreams. She saw a woman fading, a ghost staring at the life she had once built, but no longer owned. That night, when she lay down to sleep, she realized something terrifying. Grief isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, invisible, like the slow removal of photographs from a wall, like recipes vanishing from a shelf, like gifts being thrown away. Sometimes grief is losing everything without anyone even noticing. And that kind of grief, the unseen kind, can be the heaviest of all. There are moments in life that leave scars so deep you can feel them long after the words are gone. For Helen, that moment came not in the quiet isolation of her home, but out in the open, in front of strangers and neighbors, where her dignity was stripped away for everyone to see. It was a Saturday evening, the kind when the diner buzzed with energy, packed with families grabbing dinner after a long week. Helen had stopped by, not because she was asked, but because old habits die hard. She wanted to see her son, to feel like she was still part of something, even if it was just standing near the counter, offering a smile to familiar faces. She wore her nicest cardigan. The blue one Mark once said brought out her eyes. She walked in quietly, greeting a couple of longtime customers who remembered her from the early days. "Good to see you, Helen," they said warmly. For a moment, her heart lifted. Maybe she wasn't invisible after all, but then Mark's voice cut through the chatter. He was at the counter talking to staff and customers, and when he noticed Helen hovering nearby, his face tightened. He didn't smile, he didn't welcome her. Instead, with irritation sharp enough for the whole room to hear, he said, "Mom, you're just in the way. Go sit down. You're not helping." The room fell awkwardly quiet. Conversations faltered, forks paused midair. Helen froze, the words ringing in her ears. "You're not helping." Her cheeks burned. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor. She shuffled toward a booth, lowering herself into the seat as quietly as she could, her hands trembling in her lap. She heard whispers around her, the kind that cut worse than outright laughter. As if that weren't enough, a few minutes later, she tried to stand up, to walk over and offer one of the waitresses a hand when the orders piled up. She had done this 1,000 times before, back when the diner ran on her energy. But before she could take more than a step, Linda's voice rang out, bright and fake sweet. "Oh, Helen, please don't trouble yourself. Just relax. You're retired now." The word retired hit her like a slap. It wasn't retirement. She hadn't chosen to stop working. She had been pushed out, erased, discarded. Helen sat back down, her chest tight, blinking against the tears that threatened to spill. She told herself to breathe, to stay calm, to hold on to some shred of dignity. But the final blow came when a customer, a man who hadn't known the diner in its early days, looked at her curiously and asked Mark, "Who's she?" Mark chuckled lightly, shrugged, and said, "Oh, just my mom. She doesn't do much around here." Just my mom. Doesn't do much. The words landed like a hammer, crushing what little strength Helen had left. This was her life, her blood, her sweat, and in front of a room full of people, her son had reduced her to nothing. Not a partner, not a builder, not even the soul of the diner, just an old woman useless in the way. Helen felt the walls closing in. Her ears rang, her heart pounded, and suddenly the diner, the place she had once poured her dreams into, felt like a cage. She muttered an excuse, stood slowly and left, each step heavier than the last. The bell over the door jingled, a sound that once brought joy, now cutting like a knife. Outside, the evening air was cold against her flushed cheeks. She walked down Main Street, past shops lit warmly for the weekend crowd, past neighbors who waved without knowing the storm raging inside her. Her eyes stung, her chest ached, and she whispered to herself, "I'm nothing to him. After everything, I'm nothing." When she reached her house, the silence felt unbearable. She sat at her kitchen table staring at her hands, hands that had once been strong, capable, hands that had built meals and a life from nothing. Now they shook with weakness, empty and unwanted. She replayed the night again and again, his voice calling her useless, Linda's false sweetness, the stranger's question, the cruel dismissal. The humiliation was more than she could carry. It wasn't just that her son had denied her. It was that he had done it in public, stripping her dignity before the very community that had once admired her. Helen broke that night. She put her head in her hands and sobbed, deep, racking sobs that came from the core of her being. She cried for the years of sacrifice, for the little boy who had once adored her, for the woman she used to be. She cried because she finally understood there was no going back, no mending what had been shattered. This was the breaking point, the moment when her heart could no longer keep holding on, when the illusions of love and gratitude finally collapsed under the weight of humiliation. But sometimes it takes a breaking to begin again. Helen didn't know it yet, but in the ashes of this night, a new strength would eventually rise. For now, though, she was just a mother, broken and humiliated, left to pick up the pieces of a dignity that had been crushed in front of everyone. And in that dark, quiet house, with tears soaking into her sleeves, Helen whispered one last thought before sleep finally came. If I mean nothing to them, maybe it's time I learned to mean something to myself. The morning after her breaking point, Helen moved through her house like a shadow. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her body heavy with exhaustion. She made coffee but let it grow cold, untouched on the table. For the first time in her life, she felt like even breathing took effort. She didn't plan to leave the house, but Mrs. Coleman, her neighbor, knocked on the door. The older woman held a small pie in her hands, her smile soft but knowing. "Haven't seen you at church in a while, Helen. Thought you could use some company." Helen tried to protest, but Mrs. Coleman insisted. "Come with me to the community hall this afternoon. Nothing fancy, just soup and conversation." Reluctantly, Helen went. The community hall was warm, filled with people chatting, clinking spoons against bowls of soup. No one looked at her with pity. No one whispered about her being in the way. They just welcomed her, asked how she was, and listened. At one point, a woman sitting across from her leaned forward. She wasn't a close friend, just someone who had seen Helen around town. In the middle of conversation, she said quietly, "Helen, I hope you know you've given too much to people who don't deserve you. Sometimes the ones we love the most can't see our worth, but that doesn't mean it's gone." The words hit Helen like a jolt of electricity. Her chest tightened, and she blinked hard, fighting back tears. No one had ever said it out loud before. All those years of sacrifice, all those quiet acts of love, and she had believed they only mattered if her son recognized them. But here was a stranger, telling her what she had been too blind to see. Her worth didn't disappear just because Mark refused to acknowledge it. Helen walked home in silence, the words echoing in her head. She sat down at her kitchen table and stared at her hands, those hands that had built everything. She whispered, "I don't need him to see me, I need to see me." For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't grief. It wasn't joy, not yet. But it was lighter than the heaviness she had been carrying. It was possibility. Maybe you've had a moment like that too, when someone reminded you of your worth after you'd been treated like you were nothing. Did it change the way you saw yourself, even just a little? If it did, share it in the comments. Your story might be the reminder someone else needs tonight. That evening, Helen opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside was her old sewing kit, a few scraps of fabric, and a notebook filled with ideas she had once scribbled down. Dreams of recipes, notes for a catering business she never pursued. She traced the faded ink with her finger and smiled softly. Her life wasn't over. Her story wasn't finished. She realized she'd been waiting all this time for her son to give her permission to matter. But that permission wasn't his to give. It was hers, and she was ready, finally, to take it back. The night of her realization, Helen sat at her kitchen table longer than she ever had before. The small lamp above her cast a soft circle of light, leaving the rest of the house in shadows. She looked around at the walls that had witnessed her whole life, the photos, the furniture, the memories stacked in every corner. For the first time, she didn't see comfort. She saw weight, chains, the history of sacrifices that had never been acknowledged. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "It's time." There was no anger in her voice, no trembling, just quiet certainty. For years, she had begged silently for recognition, prayed for her son to look at her and see all she had given. But now she knew, waiting for his gratitude was like waiting for snow in July, pointless. The decision wasn't loud. It didn't come with slammed doors or shouted words. It came with the soft sound of a suitcase being pulled from the back of her closet. Helen laid it on her bed and began to fold her clothes. Carefully, methodically, as if she'd been planning this her whole life. She chose only what mattered: her warmest coat, the scarf her husband had once given her, a handful of blouses. She tucked in her sewing kit and her recipe notebook, the two pieces of herself no one could take away. On the dresser sat a small photo of her late husband holding baby Mark. She picked it up, her thumb brushing over the frame. For a moment, she almost put it in the suitcase, but then she stopped. She realized she didn't need to carry proof of the past anymore. She needed room for the future. She placed it back down, kissed her fingertips, and touched the glass gently before turning away. She moved through the house like a quiet ghost, collecting only the things that belonged to her, not to the family that had erased her. A favorite mug, a soft blanket, a stack of letters from her younger years. Everything else she left behind. When the suitcase was full, she zipped it shut, the sound loud in the stillness of the house. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it, her heart steady. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like crying. She felt light, almost free. She didn't leave a note. What was there left to say? She had spoken in love her whole life, and it had been ignored. This time, her silence would speak louder than words. That night, she placed the suitcase by the door. She brewed herself a small cup of tea, sat in the quiet, and let the decision settle into her bones. Tomorrow, she would step into a new life. Not for revenge, not to prove anything, but to finally choose herself. In her heart, she knew Mark and Linda might never understand. They might never notice she was gone until they needed something from her. But that no longer mattered. For the first time in decades, it wasn't about them. It was about her. When she went to bed, the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a place she had already left behind. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, closed her eyes, and whispered one final promise into the dark. I will not disappear, not to myself. When Helen stepped out the next morning with her suitcase in hand, the air felt different. It was crisp, sharp with winter's edge, but for once it didn't sting. It felt clean, almost like the world was washing itself clear for her new beginning. She didn't look back at the house as she closed the door. The past could stay there. She was walking towards something else. She rented a small room above the market on Main Street. Nothing fancy, just a narrow kitchen, a little table, and a window that let in the afternoon sun. It was quiet, and it was hers. For the first time in decades, she arranged a space not for her son, not for family, but for herself. She placed her favorite mug by the stove, spread the soft blanket on the bed, and set her recipe notebook on the counter like an anchor. The first thing she did was walk through the market stalls downstairs. Rows of vegetables, bread, and spices filled the air with scents she had almost forgotten. She bought herself fresh flowers, yellow tulips her favorite. She couldn't remember the last time she had bought flowers just for her. She set them in a jar on the table, and the room instantly felt alive. Days passed gently, and Helen started rediscovering herself. She cooked meals for one, not as duty, but as pleasure. She seasoned her soup exactly the way she liked it, not the way anyone else demanded. She played old records in the background, humming along as she chopped vegetables, sometimes even swaying softly as she stirred the pot. She also opened the drawer where she had tucked away her sewing kit. Her hands trembled at first, but soon the rhythm came back, needle, thread, fabric pulling tight. She remembered how she used to dream of designing clothes before life demanded she put those dreams aside. Now, in her little room, she mended her own blouses, then began stitching new patterns, smiling at the thought that she still had this gift inside her. Each small act was a declaration. I am here. I am mine. Helen didn't announce any of it. She didn't post photos, didn't call her son to tell him she was fine. Her rebirth was quiet, intentional, meant only for herself. She found joy in solitude, in buying a new book to read before bed, in learning how to bake bread just because she wanted to. The silence that once suffocated her now began to feel like freedom. Sometimes she would see customers from town passing through the market. They'd stop by her little kitchen when she experimented with soups, curious about the aroma. She would offer them a taste, and their eyes would light up. "This is incredible," they'd say. Helen would smile softly, keeping her secret close. She didn't tell them the story of where the recipe came from. She didn't need to. For once, her cooking was just hers. No diner, no family name, no son taking credit. At night, as she lay in bed beneath her soft blanket, Helen would think about the woman she used to be. The one who lived only for others, who gave until there was nothing left. That woman had been broken, humiliated, erased. But here, in this quiet space, a new Helen was taking shape, one who didn't ask for permission to matter. Her rebirth didn't roar like thunder. It unfolded like the steady rise of the sun, gentle, inevitable, undeniable. She smiled into the darkness and whispered, "I'm still here." And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a plea. They felt like a promise. The day was bright, the kind of winter morning where the sun shines cold but clear, cutting across rooftops and glinting on the frozen ground. Helen walked slowly through the park, a small bundle clutched in her hands. It wasn't heavy, but the weight it carried in her heart had been there for years. Inside the bundle was a photo, one of the few left of her and Mark from the diner's opening day. For so long, she had held onto it as proof that she mattered, that her sacrifices had built something real. But now, after everything, she understood. She didn't need proof. Her life didn't need validation in anyone else's frame. She reached the edge of the river, the water moving steady and calm beneath the winter sun. Helen stood there for a long moment, the cold air biting her cheeks, her breath rising in soft clouds. She thought of every meal she had cooked, every late night she had stayed awake, every small kindness no one had noticed. For years, she had believed those things only mattered if her family remembered them. But now, she knew better. They mattered because she remembered. With steady hands, she unwrapped the bundle. She looked at the photo one last time, the smiles, the pride, the boy she had raised. Then, without hesitation, she let it slip into the river. The water carried it away, turning it into nothing more than a ripple in the sunlight. She whispered into the wind, "I don't need you to see me, I see myself." The words didn't tremble. They rang with quiet strength. Helen stood straighter, her shoulders no longer weighed down. She walked back through the park with lighter steps, her coat wrapped tight around her, her scarf fluttering gently in the breeze. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel invisible. She felt free. She passed Carter's table on her way home. Through the window, she saw Mark moving from table to table, his voice animated, his gestures broad. Customers laughed, unaware of the fractures behind the smile. Helen didn't stop. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. That chapter of her life was over. Instead, she turned toward Main Street, toward the little room above the market where tulips waited in a jar by the window, and the smell of her soup lingered in the air. That was her life now, her choice, her freedom. As she climbed the stairs, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. And that night, when she lit a candle by her bed and opened her recipe notebook, she wrote a single line across the first page: "I don't need anyone's recognition. I have my own." She closed the book, blew out the candle, and smiled into the dark. Her story was no longer about being erased. It was about being reborn. And maybe you've been there too, giving everything, only to feel erased. If Helen's journey touched something in your heart, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to let go in order to find yourself again? Your story might be the freedom someone else is waiting for.